My name is Sarah, and I have a story to tell you. It all started when I was a small child, perhaps 5 or 6. That's when my parents separated. Dad, his name is Mark, he could not take it anymore. Mum, Linda, she'd been complaining about his lack of income for years, always putting him down, making him feel bad. I remember one time when my father came home from work excited about a promotion. He was grinning ear to ear. He was proud of himself for once. Mom simply looked at him and said, "That's it." I assumed you had finally gotten a real job. The light had just left his eyes. It was like seeing someone deflate. So, yes, Dad left. I cannot say I blame him right now, looking back. But at the time, it felt like my entire world was collapsing. Mom, though, saw an opportunity. Mom quickly realized that being a poor, abandoned single mother would provide her with numerous benefits at work. She'd be very direct with her boss. "I'm sorry for being late again, Mr. Johnson." She would sniffle. Sarah was sick and had no one to help her. Mr. Johnson would pat her hand and reassure her not to worry. Meanwhile, I was perfectly content to spend the morning watching cartoons while Mom did her hair and makeup. Family gatherings were the worst. Mom would hold court, recounting how Dad had abandoned us with nothing. I'd squirm in my seat, uncomfortable with the lie but unwilling to speak up. Even at that age, I knew not to contradict my mother in public. No one knew that Dad sent money every month. Child support, he called it. Mom would scoff when the text arrived. "Look at this, Sarah," she'd say, waving the paper at my face. "Your father believes that this pittance is sufficient to support a child. Pathetic." I wasn't sure how much it should be. All I knew was that it made Mom angry. And as the years passed, my life became increasingly difficult when my mother was angry. I began to notice how my mother would look at me from time to time, her eyes narrowing as if she was seeing something she didn't like. Later, I realized it was because I looked too much like my father. It evoked unpleasant memories for her. But she kept me around. I was useful. You see, the image of the struggling single mother and her brave little girl was too compelling to pass up. It earned her sympathy, preferential treatment, and even some government assistance. Then, when I was around 10, everything changed again. Mom met Richard Rich, who was successful. Richard. Being a struggling single mother suddenly seemed less appealing. She now had a new image to promote. The devoted wife of a successful businessman. And I didn't fit into that picture very well. It started small. Mom would forget to wash my clothes, so I had nothing clean to wear to school. I'd show up in wrinkled, stained clothes, my face flushed with shame as the other kids whispered and pointed. Then came the food situation. Mom would prepare these elaborate meals for her and Richard, filling the house with tantalizing aromas. But when I approached the table, she frowned. "Oh, Sarah, I am sorry I did not make enough for 3. Why don't you make your own sandwich?" I would retreat to the kitchen. My stomach growled as I pushed a peanut butter and jelly sandwich through the door. Mom and Richard were laughing, and the clink of wine glasses contrasted sharply with my meager meal. The worst was when she began interfering with my schoolwork. I'd spend hours on an assignment, only to have it vanish the next morning. I'd show up to class unprepared, stammering excuses to my teacher. My grades began to slip, and my teachers became concerned. Richard remained oblivious throughout. He was always engrossed in his work, and when he was not, his focus was solely on Mom. She'd simper and coo at him, acting the part of the adoring wife. "Richard, darling, you work so hard," she'd say while massaging his shoulders. "You deserve to unwind." He'd look up at her, completely enthralled. "What would I do without you, Linda?" Things became even worse when Mom revealed she was pregnant. Richard was overjoyed, and Mom took full advantage of the situation. "The doctor says I should get plenty of rest." She would tell me while lounging on the couch, "Be a sweetheart and clean up the house. Wouldn't you?" I'd spend my afternoons cleaning while my mother napped or called her friends. When Richard arrived home, she'd struggle to her feet, one hand on her, a barely noticeable bump. "Oh, honey, I'm so tired," she would say. "It takes a lot of effort to raise a baby." Richard would rush to her side, concerned. "Sit down, my love, Sarah. Bring your mom some water." As the months passed, I felt increasingly isolated at school. I withdrew from my friends, too embarrassed to invite them over. At home, I was barely more than a servant. expected to satisfy Mom's every whim. One night, as I lay in bed listening to Mom and Richard discuss nursery designs, something in me snapped. I couldn't do it anymore. I got out with shaky hands. I took out my phone and tried something I'd never done before. I called my father and told him everything. The neglect, the mental games, the constant sense of being unwanted. Dad listened quietly, only the sound of his breathing letting me know he was still there. When I finally ran out of words, there was a lengthy pause. Finally, he said, "Pack your bags." His voice was harsh. "I'm coming to get you. The next morning." I awoke early, my heart racing with a combination of excitement and fear. I'd already packed my bags the night before, unable to sleep from excitement. As I dragged my suitcase down the staircase, I heard Mom's voice in the kitchen, "Going somewhere? Sarah." I froze, expecting a confrontation, but when I turned, I saw my mother leaning against the doorframe, a strange smile on her face. She appeared relieved. "I'm going to live with Dad," I said, my voice stronger than I felt to my surprise. Mom smiled wider. "It's about time," she said, her tone almost cheerful. Richard and I could use the additional space for the baby. Her words struck me like a slap. But before I could respond, a car horn sounded outside. Dad was here. Mom walked me to the door. That unsettling smile remains in place. "Have a good life, Sarah," she said, practically shooing me away as I walked to Dad's car. I cast a glance back. Mom stood in the doorway, smiling broadly as she waved goodbye. It was the happiest I had seen her in years, and it was all because I was leaving. Dad's apartment was small, but it felt more like home than anywhere I had lived in years. However, we would not be there for long. Over the next few months, I watched in horror as Dad's business skyrocketed. It seemed like every week brought news of a new contract, a major client, or an expansion. Within a year, we were house hunting in the city's most affluent neighborhoods. The house we eventually bought was nothing short of spectacular. 3 stories of modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a backyard straight out of a magazine. My room was bigger than our entire old apartment, and Dad worked long hours to manage his now booming business. I threw myself into making our large house a home. I learned to prepare gourmet meals, filling the house with wonderful aromas. I kept things clean, managed the household staff, and even planted a vegetable garden in our large backyard. As the months passed, I saw Dad's efforts continue to pay off. His business continued to grow, and as a result, our lifestyle improved even more. I transferred to the city's most prestigious private school. On my 16th birthday, my father surprised me with a car. Not any car, but a brand new luxury SUV. "Now you can drive yourself to school in style," he said, handing me the keys. "Perhaps you could also run some errands for your father." As I adjusted to my new life, I found myself thinking less and less about my mother. She never attempted to contact me, and I made no attempt to reach her or any of my maternal relatives. The wounds were still raw, and the memories were too painful. Instead, I focused on my studies. Years passed, and before I knew it, I had graduated from college with honors. As I stood on the stage accepting my diploma, I looked around for Dad's face. He was there, beaming with pride, and for a brief moment, I forgot to breathe. This is how it felt to be truly and unconditionally loved. Dad pulled me aside after the ceremony. "I have something for you," he exclaimed, his eyes twinkling with excitement. He gave me a small box. There was a key inside. "It is for your new apartment in the city center. Consider this a graduation gift." Tears welled up in my eyes as I hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." It had been several years since I graduated from college. My career was taking off. I had a lovely apartment in the city and life was great. Dad and I had fallen into a comfortable routine of weekly dinners and lengthy phone calls. Everything seemed perfect until it wasn't. The news hit like a thunderbolt from the clear sky. Dad was sick. Cancer has advanced. The doctor's words blended together in a haze of medical jargon. But the point was clear. It was bad. My world became increasingly focused from that point forward. Saving Dad. I took a leave of absence from work and moved back into his home to care for him. Every waking moment was dedicated to his care. I looked into treatments, consulted specialists, and tried alternative therapies, anything that might give us a fighting chance. The months that followed were a vicious cycle of hope and despair. Every good day, when Dad felt strong enough to sit in the garden or share a meal, was followed by 3 bad days of pain and nausea from the treatments. One evening, as I was helping him back to bed after a particularly difficult day, he gave me a serious look. "Sarah," he said, barely audible, "I need you to promise me something." I nodded, unable to speak with the lump in my throat. "Promise to live your life. Actually live it. Don't let this hold you back." I wanted to argue and tell him he'd be fine, but we both knew better. Instead, I squeezed his hand and said, "I promise, Dad." He died 2 weeks later. I was holding his hand as he took his final breath, telling him how much I loved him and how grateful I was for everything he had done for me. The next few days were a blur. I felt numb as I went through the motions of planning the funeral. There were so many details to handle, including the casket, flowers, and obituary. It all felt surreal, as if I were organizing an event for someone else. I was at the funeral home, trying to decide on music for the service, when my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" "Sarah, it's your mom." I almost dropped the phone after so many years of silence. She was calling now. "What do you want?" I inquired, my voice cool. "I heard about Mark," she said, her voice softer than I recall. "I'm very sorry, sweetie. I'd like to help with funeral arrangements." I wanted to hang up and tell her to go to hell, but I was exhausted, so overwhelmed, and a tiny part of me, which I thought I'd buried long ago, I yearned for motherly comfort. "Okay," I heard myself say, "you can help." I ended the call. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just opened a door that should have remained firmly shut. But with Dad gone, Mom was the only family I had left. An hour after our call, Mom arrived at the funeral home, accompanied by my half-brother, Thomas. The kid was about 13, gangly, and awkward. I watched as Mom fussed over him, straightening his tie and smoothing his hair. It was like a knife in the gut. Seeing her shower Thomas with affection, which I had been denied my entire childhood. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Despite my reservations, I assigned her to work. To my surprise, Mom proved to be surprisingly helpful, managing the catering, arranging the flowers, and dealing with the never-ending line of well-wishers. The entire funeral was a blur. I remember standing there, numb, as people I barely knew approached to offer their condolences. Linda stayed close, occasionally touching my arm in what I assume was a comforting gesture. It felt strange, this unexpected maternal presence after years of neglect. After the service, as people were leaving the cemetery. Linda approached me again. "Sarah, I understand this may not be the best time, but I'd like to stay in touch. Maybe we should get some coffee sometime." I stared at her. This woman had made my childhood a living hell, and she was overjoyed to see me leave. However, she was the only family I had left. Maybe, I said finally. "I will think about it." To my surprise, Linda kept her promise. In the weeks that followed, she called frequently, her voice always filled with concern. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" She'd ask if you needed anything. At first, I was guarded, offering brief, non-committal responses. But as the days passed and the reality of Dad's absence became clear, I found myself craving any form of connection, even if it was with Linda. Our conversation began simply enough. She'd ask about my job, apartment, and friends. However, her questions gradually shifted. She would casually mention your father's business. "I hope this isn't causing you too much stress." Mark always worked so hard that I would deflect, changing the subject. The truth was, I was still trying to process everything Dad had left me. The company has a real estate portfolio. It was overwhelming. And something in me, some instinct honed over years of Linda's manipulations, told me to keep quiet. Linda's hints became less subtle as the weeks and months passed. Thomas is looking into colleges, and she mentioned during one call that tuition these days is just astronomical. "I'm not sure how we'll manage it." I made a non-committal noise. My guard moved up. Another time, Richard's experienced some difficulties at work. The economy, as you are aware, is having a significant impact on everyone. Each conversation seemed to lead back to money, to the difficulties they were encountering. And each time, I could sense an unspoken expectation hanging in the air. Despite my initial reservations, Linda's persistent displays of maternal affection gradually wore down my resistance to my better judgment. I began providing small amounts of financial assistance. It all started innocently enough. Helping Thomas with his SAT prep courses, buying Linda a new laptop when her old one broke down, and even covering a month's rent when Richard's company went through a rough patch. "You are an angel, Sarah," Linda would gush. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Every time I felt a warmth in my chest. Is this how it felt to have a real family? Meanwhile, I threw myself into running Dad's business. I appointed his longtime deputy as director, retaining ownership and the authority to make all major decisions. It was hard work, but every time I sat in his old office, I felt closer to my father. Linda's requests increased in frequency and size over time. What began as occasional assistance evolved into regular expectations. The breaking point occurred on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was knee-deep in quarterly reports when Linda began calling Sarah darling, her voice dripping with sweetness. "We have been thinking. It's been a long time since we took a proper family vacation. We found an incredible package deal for a European tour." I felt my stomach drop. "Linda." "I don't know. It would mean so much to Thomas," she said. "And after everything we've been through, don't you think we deserve some happiness?" Guilt and resentment clashed in my chest. Before I knew it, I had agreed to fund their trip. But it did not end there. Linda called again the day after they returned. Now, about Thomas's college fund. She spoke in a demanding tone. "We will need you to set this up right away. He has his heart set on Princeton, you know." Something within me snapped. All the years of neglect, emotional abuse, and manipulation came rushing back. "No," I replied, my voice shaking. "No more, Mom. I am done." There was a pause. Then Linda's voice returned cold and hard. "After everything we've done for you, you ungrateful little scum, how dare you abandon your family?" I laughed with a bitter tone. "Family? You mean the mother who was overjoyed to see me leave? The person who made my childhood a living hell?" The argument quickly escalated. Linda abandoned any pretense of affection, hurling accusations and insults. I gave as good as I received. Years of bottled-up rage and hurt are finally being released. "You're just like your father," she spat. "Selfish and cold-hearted." "Thank God for that," I shot back. "At the very least, he loved me." The line went dead. I stood there shaking, holding my phone in my hand. The silence that ensued was deafening. When the opportunity for a month-long business trip abroad arose, I jumped at it. A chance to get away and clear my head. As I boarded the plane, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. Perhaps this is what I needed. Take some time and distance to figure things out. After a month away, I was eager to return to the comfort of my own bed. The business trip had been productive but exhausting, and all I wanted to do was kick off my shoes and unwind in my apartment. But as I turned the key in the lock, something felt wrong. The door swung open, revealing an entirely different apartment. My carefully chosen furnishings were replaced with unfamiliar decor. A startled couple looked at me from the couch. "Who are you?" I demanded. My heart is racing. "What are you doing inside my apartment?" The man stood up, confused. "Your apartment? We bought this place a few weeks ago from Linda. I believe the world is tilted on its axis." "Linda, my mother. No, it cannot be. There must be an error." I spoke, my voice shaking. "I never sold my apartment. I have been out of the country." The couple exchanged concerned glances. "We have all the paperwork." The woman spoke hesitantly. "Maybe you should speak with your realtor." I staggered out of the apartment, my mind reeling. My first thought was to call the cops and report a fraud, but a nagging voice inside my head told me to confront Mom first. I needed to hear it from her. With trembling fingers, I dialed her number. It rang once, twice. "Hello, Sarah?" Mom's voice sounded sickeningly sweet. "How was your trip?" "Cut the crap, Mom," I snarled. "What have you done to my apartment?" There was a pause, which shocked me. Linda laughed. actually laughed. "Oh, Sarah." She spoke in a condescending tone. "If you had simply shared your wealth willingly, it would not have come to this. You brought this on yourself, you know. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. You sold my apartment. How could you? I'll go to the police. You will what?" Linda interrupted, her tone abruptly sharp. "Report your mother to the authorities. Please. We both know you don't have the spine to do that. The call ended, and I was left on the sidewalk, homeless and shocked. But Linda's smug certainty had sparked a fire in me. Without thinking, I held a cab and gave the driver Linda's and Richard's addresses. I pounded on the door. Adrenaline is coursing through my veins. Richard answered. His face was a mask of confusion. "Sarah, what is going on?" I pushed past him and entered the house. "Where is Linda?" I demanded. "She's gone," Richard said, still puzzled. "Sarah, what is this about? We are in a rush. I told him everything. The apartment." Linda confessed. All of it. As I spoke, the color drained from Richard's face. "But that's impossible," he muttered. "We don't need money for Thomas's education. I've already set aside money for that." We stared at each other, realizing the truth. Richard began pulling out financial statements and credit card bills as we pored over them, his hands shaking. A horrifying image emerged. Mom secretly took out loans, and she is now deeply in debt. Richard whispered, stunned. I had no idea. All this time, I felt a strange combination of vindication and pity. Richard was just as duped as I had been. The full extent of Linda's deception became apparent. I felt a cold resolve come over me. This wasn't only about me anymore. This was fraud, plain and simple. I did not hesitate. When I hung up with the 911 operator, a weight lifted from my shoulders. For too long, I had been Mom's victim. Not anymore. The investigation that ensued was brutal, but necessary. Linda, S deceptions, became more apparent with each rock overturned. She hadn't simply forged my signature to sell my apartment. She had been living a complete double life. Credit card statements revealed extravagant purchases, designer clothes, luxury spa treatments, and five-star hotels, all concealed from Richard and funded by a web of lies and secret loans. The trial became a media circus. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager for every juicy detail. I despised the attention, but part of me enjoyed watching Linda's carefully crafted image crumble in the public eye. Ultimately, justice prevailed. Mom was found guilty on every count, fraud and forgery, the works. The judge's words continued to ring in my ears. "Mrs. Linda Harrison, your actions demonstrate a flagrant disregard for the law and a shocking breach of your family's trust." I was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to repay Sarah Harrison the full value of the fraudulently sold apartment. Richard, bless him, was completely stunned throughout the entire ordeal. He called me Sarah the day after his sentence was handed down. He said, his voice rough and emotional, "I'm filing for divorce and I want full custody of Thomas after what she's done. I can't let her near him." In the aftermath, I had to rebuild my life. The apartment money was returned, and I purchased a small house on the outskirts of the city. A fresh start. I threw myself into running Dad's company, doing my best to honor his legacy. The work was both challenging and rewarding. For the first time in my life, I felt truly independent. Thomas and I stay in touch. He's now in college, studying engineering alongside Richard. Support. It's bittersweet, but I'm glad we still have a chance at a relationship. I haven't heard from Linda since the trial. I'm not sure if she tried to reach out. I honestly don't want to know. That chapter of my life is over.